So Andrew Yang's idea of $1,000 cash payments are finding some very unusual converts, Sagar.
Oh, that's certainly right. And here to break it down is Team Rising themselves. We have Senior Director of the Conservative Partnership Institute, Rachel Bovard, and Democratic strategist Don Calloway, two great friends of the show. Guys, I'm so sad that we're not all together, but we are in spirit in our virtual little studio. So thank you for joining us. We love to see you guys.
Glad to be social distancing with you.
Yes, we are all social distancing together. So let's, Rachel, I want to start with you because this is a really big kind of break in the American right. I was talking with Crystal earlier, which is that right now you have GOP senators, Tom Cotton, Marco Rubio, and Josh Hawley, who are essentially being more pro-working family than corporate Democratic leadership and Nancy Pelosi in terms of the bill that they put forward. They're saying we need more cash in the hands of working families. What do you make of the UBI proposal and just, I mean, in terms of the shift in the right, this is something that you and I have been working for quite a long time. It's kind of amazing to see it break into politics so quickly.
Yeah, well, first of all, I think we have to give a big congratulations to Andrew Yang, who has successfully moved the Overton window at light speed. So good on him. But, you know, I do think it's important to point out that, you know, there's a latent corporatism in both of the establishment left and the establishment right. And I think our pandemic, because so far we've only been able to help the big corporations, and not even, right? Like in the Democrat bill that passed the House, there's paid family leave in there, but not mandated for companies with more than 500 employees. Like what? So I think that there's a latent corporatism that's being exposed, but I do think that you're seeing, you know, the necessary efforts from people on the right to say, look, there is going to be a comprehensive economic response to this, but it's got to start with addressing working families because they're the ones that we want them to stay home. We want them to stay healthy. And in order to do that, they have to be able to have the resources. And so that's where I think you're seeing people on the right stand up and say, look, I don't know how, you know, we have a multiple approaches for how we're going to do it, but it has to be something that starts with working families.
Yeah, well, and Don, this is part of actually what Andrew Yang argued, which is that this isn't a big government approach. This is just like take out the federal bureaucracy and literally put cash in people's hands. So it actually has some sort of conservative intellectual underpinnings to it.
Yeah, you know, but before we get too far ahead of ourselves in praising my dear friend of 20 years, Josh Hawley, and, you know, Andrew Yang was talking about something that's sustainable and consistent, and that would be a constant in American life. This is a response to a traumatic event. Now, I do give Mitt Romney props. I do give the guys props in saying that this needs to start with working families as opposed to just being a one-time subsidy to corporate elites and industry. Let's be clear. That subsidy would do just as much to subsidize executive bonuses and executive perks as it would to maintain the working class ranks of these large corporations. But and in fairness, I have not read the bill word for word. That I have read the House bill. I have not read the Senate proposal. But they're talking about a one-time response. So it's not exactly what Andrew Yang said, but I do give them props for saying, listen, this is something that has to start by touching everyday families, whether or not you're employed, whether or not you've proven yourself as someone who contributes to this society. I think that's a very important distinction. Every American citizen should get some type of relief during this. But this is not the ongoing sustainable thing that Yang was talking about.
I couldn't agree with you more, Don. I actually talked about that in my radar today, which is that part of the issue that I see, Rachel, is that what we're going to do is we're going to have a response. And I think that's great. We're going to have, you know, the $1,000 cash injection, et cetera. But what this really should be is an opportunity to remake the American economy and remake American business. Because what coronavirus has showed us is all of the problems that we have in our economy. And like right now, we're literally seeing, Rachel, on the right, the Chamber of Commerce, which is out there saying that we should not be using the coronavirus and bailing out corporations in order to move their supply chains away from China. So this is what we're up against, right? And ultimately, I don't underestimate the power of corporatism in both the left and the right to prevail. And I think that's going to set a crazy set of political conditions over the next couple of years. What do you think, Rachel?
Yeah, I do think this has to start a conversation, right? Right now, in the immediate term, we need to be focused on, you know, helping families during containment, during quarantine, and that has to be our primary focus. But I think in the weeks to come, we are going to see a shift, and you're already seeing it. I mean, just maybe 2 weeks ago, I was having a Twitter argument with the Koch Institute analysts who were calling me a protectionist for pointing out that our supply chains for vaccines probably shouldn't be based in China. And now, 2 weeks later, you're literally seeing conservatives like Chip Roy say this, that, we need to reevaluate how we're doing business, that we cannot rely on an adversary for our life-saving critical needs. And so it's shifting very quickly because, again, this pandemic has exposed the weaknesses in our economic system, exposed, I think, a lot of the corporatism and the deference, the over-deference that our politicians have made to corporations. So I do think it's going to energize and engage, I think, a lot of people who have been wanting to point these things out, but a lot of people who can no longer ignore it because it's been exposed. Yep. And so that's what I'm really looking forward to in the weeks to come.
Well, and to your
Rachel
point,
is entirely right. I'm sorry, go ahead, Crystal.
That's okay. Go ahead. Finish your thought.
She's fully right. I mean, think about this. If the airlines need a bailout such that they cannot sustain themselves in maybe a 3 to 6 week real down period, then they were in serious trouble before. Then they were extraordinarily right? They were perhaps not efficiently or well run from business perspective, bean counting before this, right? So if you need a generationally relevant bailout for your entire industry, I question the practices of your industry prior to coronavirus ever hitting. Were there real austerity measures in place in not only the airline industry, but a variety of industries? I understand industries that are run based upon, the dollar to dollar day-to-day transactions of people in, like restaurants. But I really concern myself with the overall management of these people who we have just been told to accept the wisdom of these titans of industry in corporate America, because this really exposes, like Rachel said, overall business practices that were long before coronavirus.
Well, that's exactly it, Don, because we know with some of these airlines in particular, look, this has been a time of massive prosperity up until just recently. They all got massive tax cuts. And what did they do? They didn't invest in their workforce. They didn't invest in America. They bought their own stock back. They did stock buybacks and then ended up, with tons of leverage, tons of debt, so that when they are in this situation now, they can't weather the storm even for like 1 week, right? And it's almost like a replay of the too big to fail argument back in 2008, where it was like, well, look, you may not like the fact that the banks are totally responsible for crashing our entire global economy, but we can't afford to let them fail. And I'm hearing a very similar echo of that, in particular with the airline industry.
Yeah, we need to learn from TARP.
Yeah. Go ahead, Don, and then Rachel.
No, it's there with the airline industry. It really just kind of makes you wonder what massive industries that control our lives this type of business practice is prevalent in all across the country. Because I think we've been around long enough to know that it's not just banks and large financial institutions, and it's probably not just airline industries as well. And it shouldn't take a global crisis, whatever it may be, a terrorist attack, a war, whatever, a natural disaster. It shouldn't take a global crisis to expose business practices such that we have to bail them out. This type of corporatism and corporate elitism is happening every day all across the country. And it's just the airlines are the industry that are exposed this time.
So, Rachel, I know that you got your start on the Senate side a little bit, either around or right after the financial crisis. Talk about, you were saying that we need to learn from TARP. What do we need to learn?
Well, I think there's conservatives. I think they need to understand this is fundamentally different than TARP, right? Because they're saying we can't afford a bailout. Well, this isn't a bailout, right? This is a public health crisis. TARP rewarded the bankers that cratered the economy. And so it's fundamentally different in that regard. But I think the second thing is that, look, we didn't do anything for the working class when we dealt with TARP. We did this exclusively with the bankers. I was working actually on the House side in the House Financial Services Committee during TARP. I sat in the room with Hank Paulson and Timothy Geithner and Ben Bernanke, and I listened to them talk nothing about the working class. And I watched my grandparents lose everything. And I watched the big banks have a party in the Capitol 10 years later to celebrate how they were still in business. We cannot allow that. It has galvanized a generation. It has set the millennials back on their heels with nothing. And so I think this is something that we cannot allow to go forward. We're exposing the corporatism. We cannot yet again defer to it. Something has to change moving forward. And I'm hoping that, per the conversation we had earlier, that this is the policy conversation we start to have moving forward.
And Don, where are the big ideas on the Democratic establishment side? I mean, this paid sick leave with a massive giveaway to big corporations was absolutely pathetic.
You know, I think that this it was pathetic. And the idea that corporations over 500 employees were exempted is frankly an embarrassment to my party. But the reality is, to me, this exposes one of the great, I've used the word expose way too many times in this segment.
That's all right.
But this exposes one of the great, shall we say, secrets, I guess, of Congress that Rachel knows very well, which is an election year is a do-nothing year legislatively. Essentially, we shut everything down and focus on the elections and talk about the politics and the horse race in these various states. And there's no substantive thought coming out of Capitol Hill. There's no real policy coming out of Capitol Hill other than big corporations playing defense, trying not to be pay-fors for the lame duck session that's going to come in December after the election. And it is every member of Congress, every member of the Senate, and presidential candidates having fundraisers, trying to raise the money to remain viable and win their seats back. Every even-numbered year in Congress, legislatively, in terms of doing substantive work for the American people, is essentially a do-nothing year, and that is a major, major flaw in our congressional system. And we're seeing it because Democrats have no real solutions right now and are letting Republicans be the party of ideas in a time where working people who Democrats supposedly represent need the most help. It's a very serious problem.
Great points.
Very well said. Thank you so much to both of you. And we're going to have more with the panel right after this.